Rooftoppers, Chapter 10, Part 2. What, said Sophie? No, Charles, please, please. Thank you, sir. Charles's face was blank and careful, but the little girl will join us if she wants to. I do want to stay, said Sophie, and then, because she had remembered she wasn't supposed to talk, she glared at the clerk with her lips bitten shut. Please be seated, then. The clerk was short, and his nose came up to Charles's collarbone. When he sighed this time, it was hard enough to ruffle Charles's tie. This will not take long. Sophie glanced at Charles. Why not? She whispered. That's not good, is it? Charles gave a tiny shake of his head. His lips formed the words, Be quiet, dear heart. Sophie fell still again. The clerk said, I'm afraid I must tell you before we begin that this is not the sort of request we welcome. Oh, said Charles. Sophie kept her eyes on him. His face was as blank as a brick wall. Surely dealing with these requests is your job. It is one small part of my job, yes, said the clerk, but a request for a missing person. If you have not even met or even seen the missing person in question, seems absurd. Does it? Said Charles. How fascinating. You'll excuse me if I say that such inquiries lead only to time-wasting and disappointment, 9 times out of 10. I see, said Charles. And the 10th? Actually, I should have said 999 times in 1,000. Quite. And the 1,000th? Sir, you will not be the exception. I cannot believe that such a woman exists. There are thousands and thousands of things we have not believed, which have turned out to be true, said Charles. One should not ignore the smallest glimmer of possibility. Sir, this is impossible. You have asked us about a woman for whom you have no birthplace, no date of birth, and no profession. Sophie said, She was a musician. You told him that, didn't you, Charles? You will forgive me, Miss Smith, but women are not musicians. We do, in fact, have records of a woman called Vivian Vere, but... Oh, dear. You do? Sophie sat straight up as an arrow. Where is she? The clerk ignored her. What do they say? Charles repeated Sophie's question. What do these records say? It cannot be the same woman. If what you say is true, she was not a musician. She seemed to be in minor trouble with the law. What kind of trouble? Said Sophie. Oh, trespassing, loitering, associating with tramps and vagabonds. Anyway, she vanished 13 years ago. Suddenly, no doctor's notes, no bank records. Women of her type often disappear. We have no record of a child, and we certainly have no record of this woman on board the Queen Mary. Presumably, we may see the records of the Queen Mary, said Charles. It was a simple question, but the man's face froze. The corner of his mouth twisted downwards. Have you any reason to, sir? Of course we do, cried Sophie. She stopped. Yes? Sophie said, Nothing. She was Miss Smith, of course, who had nothing to do with Sophie Maxim. Sorry, she muttered. No. The clerk went back to ignoring her. Charles said, Curiosity is good reason for most things, I think. Have you any reason not to show them? Yes, he said. Sophie watched his eyes flick to the filing cabinets and back again. Or not precisely, that is to say. I believe the records may have gone down with the ship. That sort of search is not my responsibility. His voice grew shrill. Paperwork, sir, is not a complicated business. I'm afraid I can't help you, no. In that case, could you refer our request? Coffee? Cried the man suddenly. He rang a bell. May I offer you some coffee before you go? Thank you, said Charles, but no. I would rather discuss. I must insist. His eyes were panicked. French coffee is the best in the world. The receptionist wheeled... Why is he offering them coffee? Doesn't make sense. The reception wheeled a silver trolley into the room. She winked at Sophie. Just put it down and go, Brigitte, said the clerk. Now, what were we saying? Sophie took a mouthful and tried to swallow, but found her throat had stopped working. She spat it very quietly back into the cup. A little of it splattered onto her white top, and the clerk recoiled. Sorry, she muttered. Too hot. The clerk turned his back on her as best he could while sitting down. It looked painful. Now, what were we saying, sir? He repeated. You were saying, said Charles, that you are unable to help us find the records of the Queen Mary. I am asking you to refer our request to someone who will feel differently. Pouring out the coffee had given the man time to gather his thoughts. He moistened his frog lips. I cannot do that, I'm afraid. That is absolutely impossible. Protocol. Charles nodded. I see, he said. His politeness was deadly. Sophie, he said, could you step outside for a moment? Oh, why? Because I spat. Please don't. No, he said gently, not because you spat, but please do go. Sophie saw his face without a word. She stood up. I'll be just outside the door, she said, and shut it behind her. Outside, Sophie dropped to the floor and gripped her ankles. The corridor felt colder than it had before. It felt darker. Sophie clenched her fist and stared at the ceiling. She whispered into her knees, Please, please, I need her. Her heart was thumping painfully. That's all I want, just her. There were voices coming from inside the room. Sophie shook herself and then laid her ear against the keyhole. The metal was cold and made her face squirm, but the keyhole was large and she could hear clearly. The clerk was speaking. Ridiculous. A child's imagination. A little girl. Then Charles's voice. You underestimate children. You underestimate girls, sir. I need an appointment with the chief commissioner. And you, sir, overestimate your own importance. I cannot let you see the chief commissioner. I see. There was a pause. Sophie held her breath. The girl at reception is very charming, isn't she? She was very helpful. I fail to see what that has to do with anything. She mentioned your innovative brand of accounting. Your grasp of numbers really is unique, and your own bank account seems to appear more often than is traditional. There was a spluttering noise. Sophie guessed. The clerk's coffee had made a reappearance. Charles's voice said, I have no wish to deal in dirty things, but I feel an appointment with the chief commissioner is in both my interest and yours. This is blackmail. Quite, said Charles. Blackmail is a felony. Charles said, exactly. The clerk's voice sounded stiff and cold as a corpse. Is the girl worth it? Worth committing a felony? She is, says Charles evenly. She's bright enough to start a forest fire. She seemed fairly ordinary, said the clerk, crouched outside. Sophie bristled. People usually do until you know them, said Charles. Sophie is uniquely endowed with intelligence, grit, and at this particular moment, coffee stains. In fact, speaking of which, a chair scraped, and Sophie just had time to stumble backwards 2 steps before the door opened. Come back in, Sophie. The gentleman has good news. The clerk was whiter than before. His nostrils were curling. I can make an appointment, he said, with the chief commissioner. He may be able to help you. Thank you, said Charles. How kind of you. Tomorrow? Tomorrow is impossible. In fact, this week is very busy. I'm not sure if... Charles stood. At his full height, he loomed over the clerk. His eyebrows were at their most alarming. The day after tomorrow, then? Thank you. We'll be here at midday. Come, Sophie. For the second time that day, Sophie pulled him down to whisper. I haven't finished my coffee. Do I have to? No, said Charles. I think I'll leave mine too. It tastes like liquidated carpet. Good, said Sophie. I thought it tasted like burnt hair, actually. She spat for a second time into the cup.